Thank you so much, Jordon, for
No
agreeing.
worries. Wonderful to be with you.
To meet with you today. We put a call out to the Every Australian Counts community to say, what would you like to ask your politicians in the lead up to this federal election? I have to tell you, we got more than 200 questions.
200? That's
so
amazing.
You'll be pleased to know we're not going to ask them all.
Okay. Yeah, we might not get through all 200.
No. So what we'd like to do is we've picked a selection that are most representative, the most common questions that we got asked. But I wanted to ask, just before we get into those questions, we're here in Canberra for the budget this week, and I wanted to ask you, what was your reaction to the announcements that were made as part of the budget last night?
Look, I have to try and keep this G-rated, but I think it was a disgrace, quite frankly. If you look at the majority of the surplus, a big chunk of that's coming from money that was assigned to the scheme. This is money that hasn't been spent because the scheme in so many ways has been broken. So that's folks that needed the money but couldn't spend it, you know? And so if there is that extra buck lying about now, that needs to be reinvested into our scheme, not siphoned off into other areas, and that's what we've seen this budget do.
And can I ask you, there was one other additional announcement last night, which is the more than 500 million set aside for the Royal Commission into abuse and violence, neglect experienced by people with disability.
Absolutely. Well, look, my reaction to that is that it is a profound win for disabled people and the Green movement that have been campaigning alongside disabled people since 2014. You know, there's horrendous images on Four Corners that kind of brought home to the community the reality of our lived experience. That then triggered us to implement that set an inquiry. But for 5 years we had to kind of bang our heads against the wall. And you know, the Liberals never came on board. It took a very long time to bring Labor to the space. But last night we saw finally the money being given to make sure that it works. We need now to see the terms of reference so that we know that with confidence that money will be spent well. And we also need to see disabled commissioners leading this effort. This ain't going to work if it's a bunch of old white dudes with no lived experience. It needs to be men, it needs to be women from a range of different backgrounds who are disabled themselves.
And who understand very deeply what the issues are.
Absolutely. We really need to see that, because the story of the NDIS so far is the story of a incredible idea campaigned for by disabled people and our allies, which has then been comprehensively failed by able-bodied politicians thinking they know what's best for us. And you know, doing silly things like capping the scheme or giving us an IT system that doesn't work or not training the staff properly. And if you'd have asked disabled people back at the beginning what needed to be done, we would have told you that this needed to be done. And they didn't listen, and that's where we've landed, and that is ultimately what needs to change.
All right, well, thanks for that, Jordon. I'll get to the supporter questions now.
Let's go.
We picked this first one from Natasha because it summed up so many of the questions.
Hello, Natasha.
Why is everything taking so long? Why am I so far removed from the people making decisions? Why do I have to keep jumping through so many hoops? What do you think needs to be done to make the system more responsive and quicker?
Such a good question. First of all, we need to lift that staffing cap. The original recommendation was that the agency should have at least 10,000 employees directly, not, you know, subcontracted. It now has 3,200. That's setting up to fail from the beginning. So we need to do that. And more than that, they actually need to be, a good chunk of them, people with lived experience. And I'm not just talking about people with lived experience, you know, at the back end, administrative end. I want to be sitting down with a planner that looks like me, or that has a, you know, an autistic child, or, you know, it's a person with Down syndrome, or, you know, actually looks like the community that they're meant to be serving, so that I don't have to go through 100 million hoops of this is what my disability is before we even get to what I need. So that's number one. Number two is an IT system that works. Again, back at the beginning, the recommendation was this is a new approach to social services that requires a bespoke ICT system. It'll cost you some, but you'll make it back. Instead, what they did was they repurposed a social services, a Centrelink, an old Centrelink system, and hey presto, bad outcomes. And third, what we need to do is train people properly. I am sick and tired of the stories of people sitting down with administrators or planners that have no idea about the disability type that they are looking at. That causes so much distress, so much unnecessary fighting, and ultimately longer wait times.
Thanks, Jordon. All right, this next question is from David.
Hello, David.
How can you make the system more flexible and more person-friendly? It's very rigid and bureaucratic.
Perfect question. Number one, and it's a radical idea, you'll have to brace yourself. You should be able to see your plan before it's locked in. Wow! You wouldn't buy a garden shed if you couldn't see what you were buying before you did it, but you're meant to lay out a plan with your life goals at the centre of them without making sure that what you said is what was heard. So that's number one. Then it's how do we change things easier without triggering a whole plan review? Because people's lives change. Like, nobody is able to plan their life goals totally for a 12 month period. If we could easily do that, we'd be androids. So life changes and your plan needs to be able to flow and shape with those changes. So that's also something we could do. And also making it easier to access online through a better IT system will be able to enable people to keep on top of what's coming in, what's coming out, which gives you more certainty and gives you an ability to plan the next step forward.
And one question that we get a lot of is, why can't we move the money around?
Oh yeah, yes. Well, again, it's a bloody good question, and it is something which people in many other areas of life can do. This kind of flexibility and ability to adapt to changing circumstances is what the vast majority of people demand from various different services. I've never understood why that isn't something that disabled people can have.
Yeah. All right, so there's a bit of a follow-up question from Ruth, and she says,
Howdy, Ruth.
What could you do to make sure there's more consistency and fairness in the system? At the moment, plans seem a bit hit and miss.
Absolutely. They are hit and miss, and the result is that a scheme that was designed to actually break down the wealth disparities in terms of outcomes in the disability community, the educational disparities, is actually entrenching it. What I mean by that is, if you're a disabled person born into a rich white family, maybe with a lawyer or two in your family tree, you're maybe not going to have a bad time with the NDIS because you can cite the relevant clauses of the Act and get what you need. If you're from where I'm from, in WA, in Rockingham, and you've not had that experience in your family, you've never engaged with disability services before, odds are you're going to get a worse deal. And that is not okay. Now, what we need to do to solve that process is train planners better so that people have the knowledge to deal with these areas, and then make sure that we skill share across agency, offices and experiences. Because at the moment there's still that kind of siloed culture which we need to try to avoid at all costs.
So actually that leads up into the next question from Diane, which is, what do you think needs to be done about the training of NDIA planners and local area coordinators?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, it needs to be based in a human rights understanding of disability, translated into reality through the social model. But by that I mean you need every single person that pulls a lever in the NDIS to understand exactly what disability is, i.e. that it is created by the interaction of an impairment or a difference with barriers in society. And so therefore the job of the scheme is to break down the barriers and give you the ability to break them down yourself. So that's number one. Then it needs to be led by disabled people. I want to see trainers working with disabled people. I want to see packages developed with disabled people, and I want to see people given the right time to learn those skills on the job. There needs to be a massive focus on the recruitment of disabled planners. That needs to be a special focus for the agency, I believe, so that you can actually sit down with somebody who gets it. You don't have to explain it to them. And more than anything, I think there needs to be a continual process of professional development, so that people are given more opportunities, but also held to account. there's a little bit of holding to account here. It's not just giving you the opportunity to sit down and do Disability 101. It's about then going back and how much of it did you retain? And then not just how much we were able to retain in the test, but how much were you able to implement? What was the experience of the participant when they engaged with you? And that is something that we actually need to be more comfortable with saying, do you know what? You're not doing this quite right. You must do it like this, otherwise this isn't the right job for you.
And getting a bit of feedback from the people who are going the system on what it was like to be on the other side.
Absolutely. Anyway, I can't go into an aside, but anyway, yep, okay. Cool.
All right, I have to say this is a question that comes up all the time, both online and in our community forums. What do you think needs to be done about transport? There's no good having funding for your NDIS plan if you can't get out there and access the things that you want to do.
Oh, absolutely. Transport, like housing and some parts of AT, has been mishandled, I think, from the very beginning, to be quite honest with you. There needs to be an ability to pick the form of public transport that you need, which ultimately means coming back to a conversation about flexibility. And there needs to be an understanding that by its very nature, disabled transport, or I should say universally accessible transport, is more expensive because it isn't at scale. But the benefit of enabling somebody to participate in the community and therefore expend the other funds that they've been allocated in the economy and the community, kind of balance that out at the end of the day. So that is the approach that we need to take. It actually needs to probably look different in your rural and regional areas than it does in your urban centres. But it needs to enable the primary, like the maximum amount of choice and control on behalf of the participant, so that if I live in the city and getting to work is as easy as an Uber, but I can't take the train because the train line is inaccessible, then that's something that I can do. Or if I'm in a rural and regional area and a dedicated taxi service or something like that works for me, then I can use that too. Because being able to make the transport choice that is best for you is the real critical component here.
And so you actually mentioned housing then, and that was one of the questions that came up, is that it's from Robert. What do you think needs to be done to create more housing for people with disability?
There's a couple of things we can do, and one of them is actually slightly outside of the scheme. It's about getting our design policies broadly in Australia up to the universal standards they need to be at, so that we don't continue to create inaccessible housing solutions for people. So let's stop making things worse. When it comes to SDA and SIL, I think we need to break down the barriers that are leading people in some situations to either stay within semi-institutionalised settings or move into them when they weren't in them previously. It needs to be a really clear and simple message. If I'm a disabled person and I want to live on my own, or if I want to live with someone else, I get to make that choice. And it's not for you to say, well, that's too much of an expensive option, because that's not what this scheme is about.
This question is from Sarah. What do you think should be done to make sure that the people who are not eligible for the NDIS still get the help they need?
Absolutely. Look, what we need is a coordinated approach that says the creation of this scheme has created gaps in the medical area, sometimes in the psychosocial area. That's a massive issue. And what we need to do is work out between state and Commonwealth how we fund and fill those gaps. That's going to be a complex administrative process. But in the interim, while we're figuring that out, let's not let people fall through the cracks or you be used as pawns in a state versus federal versus local government game. My position is very clear. The Commonwealth should pick up the bill while they deal with the states and local governments to consider a long-term funding solution, because ultimately the Commonwealth is the level where the NDIS sits and can implement a universal solution across state and territory. Will it cost us money? Of course it will. Of course it will. But to be honest with you, what price solving some of these issues? We need to get ahead of it now. There needs to be urgent funding to particularly the psychosocial gap that's opened up, because people have just been left with nothing. And that is not okay.
And you can't leave people dangling while governments are arguing about whose job it is.
Worse than that, you can't use the fact that they are dangling as part of your negotiation at COAC. That's, come on, the community demands, rightly, a higher standard of politics. And, you know, if that's realpolitik in Australia, I don't want any part of it. Let's just step up as a federal government, as a federal legislature, end that and look for a long-term sustainable solution.
So lots of people asked us questions about advocacy.
Yes.
So this one was from David. Advocacy is essential for fair and adequate planning if clients are to gain the full benefits of the NDIS.
Absolutely.
So why is it that advocacy is so poorly supported? And what do you think needs to be done about it?
Well, when we consider the question of advocacy, what we're really talking about is voice. It's the ability to make your voice heard. And one of the worst outcomes through this implementation period has been the way in which the state and local levels of government across the country have stepped back from the funding of advocacy and allowed organisations to fall over precisely at the moment when they have been most needed to help people make their voice and therefore their choice heard in the transition processes. We need to get back to a form. Yes, project-based funding is good for advocacy, most certainly, but there is a real case in the advocacy space for more sustainable long-term funding so that people can have job security, so that you can work in this space with confidence. To the question of why, because it allows people to flag when things aren't working, and if advocacy funding isn't there, people can't tell you and annoy you about the problems that exist. And a lot of people in this place would be a lot happier if people weren't able to pick up the phone and say something is wrong. And that's a bad cultural reflection on Parliament, and it can't be one that's allowed to continue, because ultimately, investment in advocacy and voice is not only the right ethical thing to do, it will ensure the most efficient function of the scheme. That stops you having to go back and do your 10th plan review. It stops you having to deal with the media nightmare of, you know, this awful case blowing out of proportion. So there needs to be a different view. It's not encouraging nuisance. It's actually a human right and solving long-term problems.
People don't really understand that advocacy is problem solving, do they?
No, they don't. No, they don't. But, you know, I sometimes feel like there's this attitude that the problems in the NDIS have kind of crept up on people. And I feel like, well, if that's the case, you've kind of been crept up by an iceberg. You know, like it's been moving towards you. But, you know, if you haven't heard from people, it's because you've A, cut their funding, and B, put them on a 6-month funding cycle, which means everyone's got their second eye looking at the job application form. You know, and it's not good.
No. So I'm going to ask you one final question, and I hope you don't mind, because it's a personal question.
Yes.
So
it is my natural colour.
You were involved in the fight to get
Yes.
the NDIS up in the first place.
Yeah.
You are a person with a disability. How do you feel 6 years on, as we sit here now and we look at what's happening with the NDIS? How does that make you feel personally? We've talked about all the problems, but how does that make you feel as Jordon?
As Jordon, frustrated that we are having to fight for something that we fought so long to establish in the first place. You know, it was a national campaign. For a lot of people, it was our last shot at freedom. Yeah. Freedom is what it was fundamentally about. The right to say, I am human, I am equal, and I deserve to be supported to live with dignity. That was what the campaign was about. Brought people together in beautiful ways. And we believed that once that foundation stone had been established, it would then be about, okay, now that we're recognised as fundamentally equal, how do we actually get on with the rest of the work that needs to be done? Because the NDIS isn't the be all and end all, it's just one part. And instead what we've had to do is fight to defend, and it's been eroded. And that's incredibly frustrating. When you have conversations with, you know, I worked with a mum in WA whose child has got Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, life limiting, and in the transfer process in WA they'd been rejected, even though they weren't meant to be rejected, and they'd lost $10,000 worth of funding and all of their therapy support, and it'd taken 6 months to resolve in, again, a life limiting situation. And look, it's one call for me to fix it, but that shouldn't be the way that the scheme works, and that breaks your heart. In the same breath, I have a great pride in the community that has continued the fight. We have come together, we've organised, we've not gone quietly into the night in any shape or form, and we've continued to assert our human rights. And I think that is a great tribute to the strength of our community and what we can and will achieve together.
So on that note, because you are a really important part of our community, we have a special present for you.
Oh my God! I don't know if it'll fit.
Your own EAC.
Oh my God, that is wonderful. Thank you. It might actually fit. I'm not that fat. Wonderful. Thank you everybody so much. This is great. I've always wanted one of these.
There you go.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Kirsten.
And thank you for your time.
Oh, absolutely. Anytime. See you, everyone.